The water had gone cold an hour before. And still Josephine Hale knelt scrubbing the kitchen floor of her aunt's house. Her knuckles split and raw against the boards. You'll not sit down to supper till that floor shines like a mirror. Girl, and don't you dare expect thanks for doing what's owed. Her Aunt Verlaine called from the parlor, not even bothering to look in. Josie pressed her lips together and kept scrubbing. Nobody had thanked her for anything in 4 years. Not since the fever took her mother and father within a week of each other and left her on her aunt's doorstep with a single carpet bag and a Bible, with her mother's handwriting inside the cover. She had learned since then that gratitude was a coin nobody in that house cared to spend. She was 17 when she arrived, and she was 21 now. And in all that time, she had cooked every meal, mended every torn hem, hauled every bucket of water up from the well behind the house, while her cousin Cordelia sat at the mirror curling her hair and complaining that the Kansas sun was ruining her complexion. Verlaine called it charity, taking in her dead sister's child. Josie called it, in the private silence of her own head, something closer to servitude, though she never said the word aloud. She had learned early that speaking her mind in that house only earned her more work and less supper. The town of Millbrook Flats wasn't large, but word traveled through it faster than prairie fire. And that autumn, the word on everyone's lips was Wade Callaway. He owned the Circle K, 11,000 acres of grazing land west of town. Cattle enough to make 3 lesser men rich. And he had buried a wife 2 years back and had not so much as looked twice at another woman since. Now, it was said, he'd sent word through the preacher that he meant to marry again before winter set in. That he needed a wife who could run a household and stand beside him through hard seasons. Not some china doll who'd wilt at the first frost. The moment the words reached Verlaine's ears, she had Cordelia in her Sunday dress and practicing her curtsy by the hour. "He's rich as sin and twice as lonesome," Verlaine said, snapping a thread as she hemmed Cordelia's best blue dress tighter at the waist. "A man like that doesn't need to be charmed, Cordelia. He needs to be managed. You smile, you laugh soft, you let him do the talking. And Josephine," she turned, needle still in hand, "you'll stay in the kitchen where you belong when he calls. I won't have him thinking we keep hired help dressed like family." Josie said nothing. She had long since stopped expecting to be asked what she wanted, or introduced as anything but the niece who did the washing. Wade Callaway rode into town on a gray gelding the color of wood smoke, and the whole of Millbrook Flats seemed to hold its breath watching him tie up outside the mercantile. He was not a young man exactly, past 30, with sun-lined eyes and shoulders built from years of fence posts and branding irons. And there was a stillness about him that made people quiet down without knowing why. He'd lost his wife Rachel to childbed fever, along with the son she'd been carrying, and something in his face had never fully come back from that loss. He didn't smile easy anymore. He didn't trust easy either, not since half the unmarried women in 3 counties had started looking at him like he was a prize steer at the fair. He came to call on the Hale house on a Thursday evening, and Verlaine had the parlor scrubbed and the good cups out and Cordelia arranged, just so on the settee, like a painting nobody was allowed to touch. Josie was in the kitchen, apron still damp, when her aunt hissed through the doorway that she was needed to bring the tea tray. And to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut while she did it, she carried the tray in carefully. Steam rising off the pot, and it was Wade Callaway's eyes that found her first. Not Cordelia's practiced laugh, not Verlaine's fluttering hands. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected. A plain, direct look, no calculation in it. "Thank you," he said, taking his cup from her hands. Just that. 2 words spoken like they cost him nothing and meant something anyway. Josie nearly dropped the tray. She managed a small nod and stepped back toward the kitchen doorway, but Verlaine's voice cut sharp behind her. "That's my niece, Mr. Callaway. She helps about the house." Cordelia, tell Mr. Callaway about the social you're planning for the harvest. Cordelia launched into some bright chatter about lanterns and fiddle music, and Josie slipped back into the kitchen where she belonged. But she carried the memory of those two words with her the rest of the night, like a coal held close against the cold. Thank you. She turned them over so many times in her mind that she nearly burned the cornbread. It became a habit after that. Wade calling on Thursdays, Cordelia primping and preening in the parlor, Josie carrying trays and clearing dishes and staying silent as instructed. But he kept noticing her. He noticed the way she moved quick and sure through work that clearly exhausted her. He noticed the callus on her thumb from the needle, the burn scar along her wrist from the stove, and one evening, when Cordelia excused herself to fetch her shawl and left an awkward silence in the parlor, he spoke to Josie directly for the first time. "You run this whole house, don't you?" he said. "Not a question, really?" Josie kept her eyes on the cup she was polishing. "I do what's needed, Mr. Callaway. Somebody ought to thank you for it." "Somebody doesn't need to," she said, quieter than she meant to. "It's expected of me." He was quiet a moment, studying her in that still way of his. "Expected and deserved aren't the same thing," he said. And then Cordelia came back in with her shawl and her laughter, and the conversation was swallowed up whole. That winter came on hard and early, and the Circle K lost 200 head of cattle to a blizzard that buried the whole county under 3 feet of snow for a week. Wade came into town gaunt and grim, needing hands, needing help, needing someone who understood what it meant to work until your body gave out, and then work more. He said as much one evening, sitting stiff in the Hale parlor, and Cordelia's face went pale at the mention of frozen fingers and lost sleep. "Surely you have men for that sort of thing," Cordelia said, fanning herself though the room was cold. "A wife oughtn't have to muck about in snow like a hired hand." Wade's jaw tightened. "My mother worked beside my father every day of their marriage, snow or shine. I don't think less of a woman for having strong hands, Miss Cordelia. I think less of one who's afraid of them." The silence after that was long and uncomfortable, and Verlene rushed in with talk of lemon cake to smooth it over. But something had shifted in the room, something Josie felt even from the kitchen doorway, where she stood with a rag still in her hands. It was 2 nights later that Wade came calling unannounced. Later than usual, on some excuse about a borrowed harness he needed to return. Verlene and Cordelia had already retired, worn out from a day of visiting, and it was Josie alone in the kitchen, on her knees again, scrubbing a floor nobody would ever notice was clean, when she heard the knock and answered it herself, forgetting to smooth her apron or hide the exhaustion on her face. "Mr. Callaway, they've gone up for the night, I'm afraid." "I know," he said. "I saw the harness was already returned this morning. I came anyway." She blinked at him, water still dripping from her hands. "Why?" "Because I wanted to talk to you, and there's never a moment in that parlor where anybody lets you finish a sentence." He looked past her into the kitchen, at the bucket and the rag and the floor half scrubbed in the lamplight. "It's near midnight, Miss Hale. The floor doesn't know what time it is." Something almost like a laugh moved across his face, gone as quick as it came. "Does anybody in that house ever tell you thank you?" The question landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her chest. And to her own surprise, her eyes went hot and stinging before she could stop them. She looked down at her raw hands so he wouldn't see. "No," she said, and her voice cracked on the single word. "Not since my mother died. I do the work because if I don't, I've nowhere else to go, Mr. Callaway. I'm not family here so much as I'm useful. There's a difference, and I've had for years to learn it." He was quiet a long moment, and when she finally looked up, there was no pity in his face, which she was grateful for, because pity was a thing she couldn't have borne just then. There was something else instead, something that looked like recognition. "I know a little of being useful instead of wanted," he said. After Rachel died, folks came round plenty, wanting my land, my cattle, my name for their daughters. Not many came wanting just me. You learn to tell the difference too, after a while. I'm sorry, Josie said softly. About your wife. I'm sorry about your folks. He turned his hat over once in his hands. For what it's worth, Miss Hale, that floor already shines. Somebody ought to have told you that an hour ago. He set his hat back on and stepped off the porch into the cold. And Josie stood in the doorway a long while after he'd ridden off, her heart doing something unfamiliar and frightening in her chest. Verlene noticed the change in Wade's manner before Cordelia did. The way his eyes drifted toward the kitchen doorway during his Thursday calls. The way his questions started to include the word Josephine, where before there had only been Cordelia. It set something ugly loose in her. You'll not go near that man again, Verlene said to Josie one morning, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. You understand me? Cordelia's future is riding on this match, and I won't have you ruining it with your simpering and your sad eyes. There's a Mr. Pruitt over in Cassidy County looking for a housekeeper wife, older man, but steady. I've half a mind to write him about you before you cause any more trouble. Josie pulled her arm free, something hardening in her that hadn't been there before. I haven't done anything but pour tea, Aunt Verlene. You've done plenty just standing there, Verlene snapped, and stormed off to find Cordelia a new ribbon for Saturday's harvest social. The very one Wade Callaway had promised to attend. The social was held in the Grange Hall. Lanterns strung along the rafters, fiddle music sawing away bright and quick, tables groaning under pies and cider. Josie wasn't meant to attend at all. She was meant to stay behind and finish the ironing, but Wade himself, arriving early, asked after her plainly enough in front of half the town that Verlene had no choice but to let her come. Dressed in her one decent gray dress, hair pinned simply, standing at the edge of the room like she half expected to be sent back to the kitchen at any moment. Cordelia, sensing the tide turning against her, grew desperate as the evening wore on. She laughed too loud at Wade's jokes, pressed close to his arm during the dancing. And when none of it seemed to draw his attention fully away from the far corner where Josie stood quietly watching, she turned cruel instead. It's a wonder my cousin even came tonight, Cordelia said loudly. Loud enough to carry, tugging Wade toward the punch table where Josie stood. She's more comfortable scrubbing floors than standing on one. Aren't you, Josephine? Show him your hands. Go on. Show Mr. Callaway what 4 years of gratitude looks like. The hall went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something cruel has just been said in public. Josie felt her face burn, felt every eye in the Grange Hall land on her raw, chapped hands. And for one terrible moment, she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floorboards. I've seen her hands, Wade said, and his voice was calm, but it carried the length of the hall. I've seen what those hands built. Fires lit before dawn, floors that shine. A whole household run smooth while nobody so much as looked her way to say much obliged. I've got 200 head of cattle dead in a blizzard and a ranch full of hands who worked themselves to the bone for wages, and thanks both. Miss Cordelia, I don't have much use for a wife who'd mock somebody for working hard. I've had my fill of pretty things that wilt. Cordelia's face went a blotched, furious red. Verline surged forward, sputtering apologies and excuses, but Wade wasn't looking at either of them anymore. He crossed the hall, past the punch table, past the staring townsfolk, until he stood in front of Josie, who hadn't moved, who felt frozen straight through despite the warmth of the packed room. Miss Hale, he said, quiet now, just for her. I know I've no right asking this in front of the whole county, and I know you've had precious little reason to trust a man's promises. But I'm asking anyway, because I don't think I'll get braver waiting. Will you marry me? Not because I need a housekeeper, and not because your aunt wants it. Because I've watched you for months running. And I've never once seen you do a single thing that wasn't worth thanking you for. And I mean to spend the rest of my life making sure you hear it." The whole Grange Hall seemed to be holding its breath along with Josie. She thought of the cold floor, the raw hands, the 4 years of silence where gratitude should have lived. She thought of her mother's Bible, the only thing anyone had ever given her without expecting something back. And she thought, too, of the terrible risk of it if she said yes and it went wrong. She would have nowhere left to run to, no aunt's house to return to. Nothing but pride and a broken heart to keep her warm. "You don't know me well enough to promise that," she said, but her voice shook. And it wasn't fear alone shaking it. "I know you knelt on a cold floor at midnight and didn't complain once," Wade said. "I know you carried trays for a family that never once asked you to sit down at their table. I know when I said 2 words to you the first night I met you, you looked at me like nobody had said them to you in years. That's enough knowing for me, Miss Hale. The rest, I mean to spend a lifetime learning." Josie looked past him for a moment. At Verlene's furious, humiliated face, at Cordelia, near tears in the corner, at the whole town of Millbrook Flats, watching to see what the overlooked niece would do with the one thing nobody had ever offered her before. A choice. "Yes," she said. And then, stronger, "Yes, Mr. Callaway, I'll marry you." The fiddle music started up again, somewhere behind them. Uncertain at first, and then swelling full. And the Grange Hall broke into noise and movement, but Josie barely heard any of it. She was looking up at Wade Callaway's face, at the small, unguarded smile breaking across it. The first she'd seen from him since the day they'd met. They married in December. In the little clapboard church at the edge of town, snow falling soft outside the windows. And Wade Callaway stood at the altar in his good coat and watched his bride walk toward him like a man who couldn't quite believe his own good fortune. Verlene did not attend. Cordelia sent no word. But half the county came anyway. Curious to see the quiet niece nobody had ever thanked become the woman a rich rancher had chosen above all others. And when the preacher pronounced them married, Wade took Josie's raw, work-worn hands in both of his own and pressed his lips gently against her knuckles, right there in front of God and everybody. "Thank you," he whispered, "just for her, for every single day, starting now." Out on the Circle K that first spring, Josie learned what it meant to be thanked for ordinary things: a meal well cooked, a fence mended, a cold morning made warmer by nothing more than her presence in the kitchen. Wade said it plain and often, not because the words were owed, but because he meant them. And slowly, season by season, the girl who had knelt, scrubbing floors in silence, learned to stand up straight and believe she deserved the words when they came. Years later, when their own daughter was old enough to help around the ranch house, Josie would kneel beside her at the hearth some evenings and show her how to bank the fire for morning. And always, without fail, when the girl finished a chore, "Well done," Josie would take her small hands in her own and say the words out loud, slow and certain, the way nobody had ever bothered to say them to her. "Thank you." Because in that house, on that land, gratitude was never a coin too dear to spend. And nobody, not ever again, would go unthanked beneath its roof.